Hi everyone. Welcome to the third installment of Election Watch with USP, a short podcast series by the US program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore. I'm your host, Kevin, an associate research fellow with the US program, and I'm joined by my colleague Adrian. If you missed our first two episodes on the GOP convention and the VP Harris campaign, I'd encourage you to give it a listen after this. This Election Watch series might just be a subset of our regular programming on US foreign policy, but it's still an important field for any observer of the US to understand. Today, our episode is titled A Beginner's Guide to US Elections. To the layperson, especially one on the other side of the world, US election procedures can seem confusing and needlessly complicated. How many races are being held in November? How does the Electoral College work? We've heard all these questions and more from our colleagues and friends over the past few weeks, so we thought it'd be helpful to answer them in a special episode. To start us off, let's unpack the election schedule a bit. When we talk about the November election, how many different races are there? Just off the top of my head, there's the presidency, there's 33 of 100 seats in the Senate, and all 435 seats of the House of Representatives as well. And that's not to mention the races at the state level too.
Yes, Kevin. So you are correct about the federal races, but there will also be state and local elections held at the same time in November. So on November the 5th, 11 states will also hold gubernatorial elections. 44 states will hold legislative elections for 85 legislative chambers. Basically, we're talking about 2/3 of all upper house seats and almost 90% of all lower house seats in the states. And this doesn't even get us to the local elections. I just found this out quite recently, that by one count, there are more than 500,000 elected office holders in the United States. Yes. Right. So we're talking about everything from President of the United States down to US senators, to governors, to school board members, and special district members. So for our listeners, when American voters go to the polls in November, for many of them, their ballots are more like books, right? So at the top of the ballot, president, U.S. senator, if there's a Senate election, House of Representatives, and it goes down the list. So for many voters, they basically give up halfway out of sheer exhaustion of trying to vote for all these multiple offices. In many instances, what we have is something called roll-off, where voters vote for officers at the top end of the ballot, but they just simply leave
the others blank.
I
see. So Adrian, is it true then that Democrats are generally a bit less stringent about voting down ballot as compared to Republicans?
No, I don't think there's any statistical difference between the parties on down ballot voting. But there are some states that allow for straight party ticket voting. So at the top of the ballot, right, some states allow voters to tick a box that says, they're going to vote straight ticket Democrat or straight ticket Republican.
Yeah, that would make it easier, that's for sure. But there are also quite a few votes on amendments as well, right? To do things like enshrine abortion access in the state's constitution, like in Missouri and Arizona. Who decides to add these amendments to the ballot and why?
That's a great question. Before we get to the states and how they amend their constitutions, right? I think we need to put it in context. And the context here is the comparison to the US Constitution. Right? So the US Constitution is extremely difficult to amend. By the most common method, it requires a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, and for 3/4 of the legislatures of the states to ratify these amendments. So as a result, the Constitution has only been amended 27 times, right? The last of which occurred in May 1992. So by comparison, state constitutions are much easier to modify. And state constitutional amendments, like some of the ones that you mentioned, are adopted on a regular basis, right? So by one count, the constitutions of the 50 states have been amended more than 7,000 times.
Oh, wow.
But because the US is a federal system, it is going to vary across the states how amendments are proposed, how amendments are adopted, how amendments are passed, and how easy this process occurs will vary across the states, sometimes quite dramatically.
I see. Have there been cases where, putting these amendments on the ballot has been used to kind of attract voters to vote in these elections as well?
So that, I think, again, depends on what those amendments are, right? Who proposes those amendments? And, the likelihood of those amendments being passed. And I know it's very confusing for our listeners, right? These things will also vary across the states.
Sure, that's for sure. Although, another question I have is picking up on what we discussed just now about down-ballot voting. Political scientists sometimes refer to the coattail effect, in which the victorious presidential tickets, they help to generate momentum for their parties, secure majorities in the legislatures. Does this happen often in US elections, especially as of late?
So the coattails effects have become less prominent over time, right? So the congressional races, House, Senate, have been to some extent decoupled from the presidential elections because they have their own dynamics in terms of candidate selection, the ability of candidates to raise large sums of monies now for their campaigns, and also about the issues that are being debated or being fought on for these races. If those races are nationalized, if there are national issues at stake, then there's a greater likelihood of some of these coattail effects showing. So if we look back at 2020, President Biden had, if I recall correctly, like the second weakest coattail effects of the last 100 years, right? So only JFK had smaller coattail effects.
So that means some voters must have, they voted for Biden against Trump, but below that, it was red all the way.
So in that instance, there is evidence of split ticket voting, right? So very likely Republicans voting for Biden because, right, they didn't want to vote for Trump, but still voting Republican for House and or Senate.
I see. Thank you. So, Adrian, speaking of elections in general, one of the big questions we've received is what the Electoral College is, how it works, and why it was created. Do you have any comments to start us off?
So those are all very good questions. So the origins of the Electoral College lie in the Constitutional Convention. So one of the most contentious debates during the convention was about the presidency. So if we think about, what the framers were thinking about in 1787, they basically had very little to work with in terms of a template for what would become the presidency. For most states, countries at the time, right, they had kings, queens, princes, and they had some experience with colonial governors as chief executives. But compared to the other branches, Congress, the courts, there was no clear precedent for them to take on deciding about the nature, the powers of the presidency. So not surprisingly, one of the many contentious issues, again, about the presidency was how to elect the president. So there was one group of framers who wanted the president to be elected by Congress, right? And this, of course, then was met by vehement opposition. They said, you cannot have the president elected by Congress because it would fundamentally violate the separation of powers.
Mm.
Right? A president would then be beholden
To the legislature.
to the legislature. There are possibilities for corruption, collusion, if Congress were to elect the president. Then another camp wanted direct elections for the president by then a rather small electorate, right? But they wanted direct elections. Then those who oppose it, you cannot possibly trust the people, right, to elect the president. What do they know? So during one of the debates, one of the framers said that, throwing the election to the people was akin to asking blind people to decide on colors. Fear of the mob. Democracy then was considered the rule of the mob.
Mm.
There was fears that if there were direct elections for the president, you would get populists
Mm.
who would pander to the people to get elected, re-elected. So the compromise, as much of the Constitution was this process of the Electoral College. And if readers look at the Constitution, right, the Constitution does not actually mention the term Electoral College.
Mm.
It is a shorthand for a process where the states are enjoined to appoint electors equivalent to the number of representatives and senators.
Mm.
So this means that larger states will have more electors than smaller states.
Yeah, like Texas has 40, right?
Yes.
And then California 54 and so on.
Yes. But because the electoral votes of each state also include the number of senators,
Mhm.
it also disproportionately benefits small states.
Yeah.
So there is this tension, right? So larger states have more electoral votes, but it is also structurally biased in favor of small states.
Mm.
Then with the 23rd Amendment, the District of Columbia was awarded 3 electoral votes and treated as a state in terms of presidential elections.
Hmm. I see. So about these state electors, can you tell me more about their role? And I think a big question is, how do they decide who to vote for? Do they have any autonomy in the process? Or is the decision already predetermined?
So electors are appointed by the state, again, in different fashions. So it is basically up to the state parties to select a group of electors, right? So the term is a slate of electors. Different states, different rules as to who these electors are. But there is a constitutional injunction, right, that says that representatives, senators, right, those who hold an office of public trust of the United States cannot be electors. Right? So no member of Congress, no senator, no cabinet member, for example, right, can be an elector.
Yeah, conflict of interest that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
So typically what happens now is state party organizations appoint party leaders, elected officials, right, people who have been active in the party as, right, a reward, so to speak, right, as electors. And these electors are pledged but not committed to vote for the party's candidates in the presidential election. There is then always the possibility of you were suggesting, that these electors end up not voting for the party's candidates, right? These so-called faithless electors. So certain states have put in place sanctions against these so-called faithless electors, fines. In 2020, there was a faithless electors case that made its way to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court then ruled that states could, in fact, enact pledges that these electors, right, would sign that would commit them to vote for the party's candidates. And the parties could also enforce these pledges by fining these faithless electors. So if we look over the span of American political history, right, there have been faithless electors. They are not uncommon, still very rare, but no election has been decided one way or another as a result of these faithless electors.
That sounds kind of workable on paper, but I'm sure it's pretty complicated in practice, right?
Yes. So one of the things that the framers did not anticipate was the development of political parties.
Yes, that's true. Even George Washington warned against it, right?
Yes, he warned of the baleful effects of the party spirit. So when Washington was president, it really didn't matter because the two elections that he contested, right, he was unanimously elected as president in the Electoral College. So Washington is still the only president who has unanimously won all the votes in the Electoral College. If you look at the Constitution as it was originally written, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 says that the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for two persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. So what happened in the election of 1800 was we had John Adams, the incumbent vice president, square off with Thomas Jefferson, the incumbent vice president, because in the election of 1796, the Electoral College process as written, right, said that the candidate with the most votes and with a majority of the votes would be president, and the runner-up would be vice president. Right, but at this time, we're already having this proto-party system. Adams is a Federalist, Jefferson, the leader of this nascent Democratic Republican Party. So we have a president of one party and a vice president of another party. So it made for very awkward 4 years for Adams and Jefferson. But it gets worse. In the election of 1800, as I mentioned, they square off and they supposedly have their vice presidential candidates. In the election, Jefferson supposedly wins, right? But he and his vice presidential candidate, or his supposed vice presidential candidate, have the same number of electoral votes. And his vice presidential candidate is Aaron Burr. So Burr doesn't say that he is the vice presidential candidate and Jefferson is the presidential candidate. And so with the Electoral College count deadlock, it is then thrown to the House of Representatives. But it is a House of Representatives that is still controlled by the Federalist Party. And Jefferson is the mortal enemy of the Federalists. But even the House is deadlocked. So for 35 ballots, 35 rounds, the House cannot elect a president.
So Kevin McCarthy wasn't actually that bad.
No. Right? So who breaks the deadlock is Alexander Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton convinces some Federalists to vote for Jefferson on the basis that even though he loathes Jefferson, right, Hamilton says it is better to vote for someone with wrong principles than to vote for someone with
who has none.
None, right? Aaron Burr.
Now that you mention it, now I'm thinking back to the Hamilton musical and that song.
Yes, right. So finally, the House on the 36th ballot breaks the deadlock and elects Thomas Jefferson as President of the United States. And of course, Burr never forgives Hamilton. And only a few years later, two of them will duel in Weehawken, and Burr will shoot and kill Alexander Hamilton. So as a result of 1800, the 12th Amendment is passed.
Mm-hmm.
And so the 12th Amendment says that when the electors cast their ballots, they must distinctly mark ballots cast for president and vice president.
Mm.
Right? And also what the 12th Amendment does is if there is going to be a contingent election in the House, right? These contingent elections are the House voting for the president. And our listeners should note that when the House holds these contingent elections to vote for the president, the states vote en bloc. So state delegations vote en bloc. So even though large states like California, like Texas, and Florida have large congressional delegations, they only get one vote.
Mm-hmm.
And contingent elections are held in the Senate to vote for vice president. But there, it is by simple majority, with each senator having a single vote.
So, Adrian, given how this electoral college is set up, that does raise the possibility that a presidential candidate can win the popular vote, but lose the election altogether. The example that comes to mind is 2016 and Hillary Clinton. But are there any other notable examples in history?
Yes, there have actually been 5 instances. So the most recent example was, as you pointed out, Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
In 2000, right, Al Gore won the popular vote, right, but lost the electoral college as when the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore, right, sort of ended the recount in Florida that gave Florida's electoral college votes to George W. Bush.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there were instances in 1888 where Grover Cleveland won the popular vote but lost the electoral college vote to Benjamin Harrison.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1876, Sam Tilden won the popular vote but lost the electoral count to Rutherford B. Hayes. Right, one of the most interesting instances was in 1824.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1824, it was actually a 4-way race for the presidency. So we had Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Clay, and a sort of former Treasury Secretary. But really, the top 2 contenders were John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, and the hero of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson. So what happens in the elections is Jackson gets a plurality of the popular vote and the electoral college, right? But because nobody has a majority, it is the House holding a contingent election that votes for president.
And they didn't like him, right?
And nobody liked Andrew Jackson. So, right, the Henry Clay and all, right, sort of they maneuver it such that John Quincy Adams wins the contingent election. Right, so this leads to Andrew Jackson, right, and his claims of stolen elections. Right, but Jackson will get his revenge, so to speak, when he wins the presidency in 1828.
I see. Given these kind of messy outcomes, have there been any serious efforts to try and reform the Electoral College, especially, in the 20th or even 21st century?
That is a very, very interesting question. So the American Bar Association did a count, and the most popular proposed amendments to the Constitution have been to basically either modify or to get rid of the Electoral College. But, as we talked about earlier, it is extremely difficult to amend the Constitution. And given that the Electoral College has a small state bias, it is going to be difficult, if not impossible, to get these small states, these swing states, right, to give up their influence, their outsized influence.
Yeah. In past years, New Hampshire loved having the spotlight on it every 4 years, right?
Yes. To get Pennsylvania or North Carolina, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona to give up their pivotal swing vote status is going to be hard, if not impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So if the constitutional amendment route is closed off, so some states have come up with something called the Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is an agreement to award their states' electoral college votes to the winner of the nationwide popular vote.
Mm.
But this has not come into effect because this interstate compact will only come into effect once the states that are party to it are also a majority of the electoral college votes. But this is also not the only way to apportion electoral votes. We have Nebraska and Maine that apportion their electoral votes on a proportional basis, or at least some version of a proportional basis.
Yeah.
The winner of each of their congressional districts gets that electoral vote.
A whole part of Nebraska can go red, but any two, I think, is the one that goes blue quite often, right?
Yes, right? And then the other two electoral votes, right, the votes that accrue to the state because of their senators, right, are awarded to the winner of the nationwide vote. So there's really nothing stopping individual states from following Nebraska or Maine's examples, right, that would move away from the winner-take-all that we have right now.
So, Adrian, a final few quick questions then. What does Election Day look like in the US? Is it a public holiday like it is for quite a few other countries in the world? And is voting mandatory for Americans?
Great question. Election Day is not a public holiday in the US, right? Since 1845, it has been set as the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November.
Yeah.
So this again has to do with 18th century agricultural practices in the United States.
Mm.
So it was set in November so that harvest was over and done with.
Yep.
It is a Tuesday, so God-fearing folks could go to church on Sunday, right? Travel to their polling places, which used to be in their county seats. They would vote on Tuesday and be able to make it back in time, right, to go to the farmers' markets, which were usually held on Wednesdays. So we've been stuck with that since the mid-1840s. It is not a public holiday, so voters have to take time off work or sacrifice their lunch hour to get in line to vote or to vote after work. But this makes it very difficult for a lot of voters. And so we see, in comparison to a lot of America's advanced industrial democratic peers, turnout in the US is low. And it is also low because there is no automatic voter registration. In most of these other advanced democracies, the national government that maintains a national voter roll. And registration is automatic. In the US, it is not. So voters in the states, and states have different rules about registration, and the difficulties also vary across states, but they have to make steps to register to vote. But once they are registered to vote, right, if we just look at registered voters do turn out at relatively high levels.
I see. So, Adrian, building off of that, who qualifies for absentee ballots then, and how are these votes counted?
So absentee ballots or mail-in ballots, again, who qualifies, how they are counted, depends on the states involved. So some states are very liberal, so to speak, in terms of who qualifies for absentee ballots. Washington State basically conducts all its elections via mail. Some states require that you produce an excuse, right, before they allow for these so-called absentee ballots. So you have to be sick, you have to be in hospital, or you may be going to college, right, in another state. And states also vary in terms of how early you have to apply for absentee ballots. And of course, right, absentee ballots will also be distributed to citizens living in or working in another country. The military votes by absentee ballot as well. And so basically, all these ballots still have to be counted, right, before the certification date for the Electoral College votes.
But how are they counted on the night itself? I believe there's certain states have very specific rules about how they can be counted. Like some of these absentee ballots must be hand counted, right?
Yes, because it is states and local governments that are in charge of the election process and the election infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
There is also going to be, right, a fair deal of variance in terms of how these votes are counted, right? The qualifications, as you put it, whether they have to be physically delivered into the vote counting centers by election day or whether they just have to be postmarked by election day.
But as a result of that, there's a certain amount of, caution you should take when you look at the results that come in on the night of the election, right? Because there's still some votes, particularly those mail-in votes that haven't been counted yet.
Yes, but of course, that also depends on how close the elections
that's
are,
true.
right? So if it's a landslide election, and then those mail-in ballots will probably not make much of a difference. But in close elections and where every vote counts, right, then yes, those mail-in ballots may end up making the difference.
In that case then, Adrian, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave the audience with?
So I understand that the American political process, the voting process, is highly complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, to be honest, most Americans don't even understand the intricacies of this process. So I would like our listeners, again, to give us feedback if there are other questions on topics on the electoral process, the voting process, to drop us a note and we would be happy to try to answer their questions.
That's right. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Like Adrian said, if you'd like to give us any questions for us to tackle in future Election Watch episodes, feel free to reach out to us on social media or through email. Until next time, stay safe, and we'll see you again.